All right. I'm going to start on my presentation on sort of a couple, more or less categorization, sort of loosely, of some biological risks and some things you'd want to think about, both in terms of sort of forces pushing in the direction of not sharing and forces that sometimes might push in the direction of sharing. I didn't quite get as much time to work on this as I'd originally wished, so like it's going to be pretty rough. But it's loosely based off of sort of in progress blog posts myself and a couple other people were working on. So a couple of useful ideas to go over first. One of them is because I think they require a little more explanation than most of the other categories further down, and they kind of relate to some of these things. One of them is the unilateralist curse, which is, in some sense, almost a principle that a thing that it looks like a good idea on the surface, and that you then find out is a terrible idea, is like the worst kind of idea, because in all likelihood, if you came up with it, then someone else will also come up with it. And if there's a lot of people who are likely to come up with the first idea, some of them might not realize that is also a terrible idea. So sort of, there's an assumption that the probability that an action will be taken is higher when you have more actors. You might just come to that decision independently. So every additional actor has a chance of misjudging the situation, especially if it's a kind of tricky to realize the trade-offs that are playing out. And this could be a concern for fields such as weapons technology, and that someone might publish information or leak it, or sort of irreversible decisions such as the release of certain animals that, I don't know, you might be able to end up with a to swallow the spider to eat the fly kind of situation where you release something and then that comes out of control, and then that makes you feel like you have to release another thing. Like Australia is just kind of notorious for having no idea what to do with mainland organisms. So here's a rough equation based on that. So you've got n, sort of the number of people who might think of the idea, the probability that each of them think of the idea, probability that they think it's a good idea, 1 minus the probability that they realize it's a bad idea, plus the probability that they implement it if they just think it's a good idea. So you sort of have to worry about sort of if it's got a low probability that that if they've got a large number here, if they've got a high likelihood of thinking of it, if they've got a high likelihood of thinking it's a good idea, and if you've got a low likelihood of realizing it's a bad idea, or a high likelihood of implementation, because the good form is just so compelling that you can't not. So any part of these could sort of contribute to this. There's also the Streisand effect, which is basically when information suppression goes horribly, horribly wrong, and you accidentally spread information instead of suppressing it because you were trying to suppress it. The original example, and where the name comes from, is this photograph here, is Barbara Streisand's seaside mansion. Someone took a series of photos of the California coastline, and it was like one of thousands. And she filed a lawsuit to take that photo down. And before the lawsuit was filed, it had been downloaded, 4 to 6 times, mostly by her lawyers. And after that, it became hundreds of thousands because it ended up not working out well for her either. The lawsuit did not succeed, and she ended up having to pay the legal fees for the guy who had taken the pictures for the people who had taken the pictures of the California coastline. So yeah, paradoxically, this is her trying to suppress this information was the worst thing she could have done. Couple of additional examples. There's the Rocco Basilisk incident, and Why the Lucky Stiff is a sort of guy in the Ruby community. He committed info-suicide at one point, just kind of deleted all his stuff, and that ended up making him almost notorious, which was exactly what he didn't want. So, risks of information sharing. Here's some very rough categories we were rolling with. First one is sort of you've got bad ideas, you got implementation details, and then you've got bad actors and careless actors. They're very loose categories, and there's going to be like some degree of gray area between a lot of them, but it was sort of a distinction we thought might be useful. So, bad conceptual ideas and bad actors. So, a toy example, I don't know particularly of like real life examples. I mean, maybe Aum Shinrikyo, like running into the idea of maybe using Ebola, but they didn't even succeed at that. They sort of failed for lack of implementation. But toy example is if a biosecurity researcher writes something and that gives a bioterrorist a solidly bad idea that they then are able to implement. But yeah, this looks mostly to be like less of a problem, just given that there's probably not that many bioterrorists, and there's probably, but it's a potentially like severe one in the few cases where you might actually run into a competent bioterrorist or something. Bad conceptual ideas to careless actors, and I chose to focus on real life examples just because some of these actually have those. This one, there's the release of rabbit hemorrhagic disease in New Zealand in 1997. So New Zealand, like Australia, had the rabbits problem. And they sort of had rabbit hemorrhagic disease was used in Australia as a biocontrol tool, but so some people also wanted the same thing to happen in New Zealand, and the government looked at it and ended up concluding that it would have like some other bad effects, and they denied it. But not that long after that, the rabbit hemorrhagic disease started showing up in New Zealand, and they're pretty sure farmers started spreading it deliberately. And I think it might have had some bad effects on the wildlife. I don't remember the specific details, but the farmers might not have. But like there's the question of how the farmers ran into this idea, and it could have been that sort of, well, they heard of it somewhere. I don't know that they would have come up with it completely independently. And they just went ahead and took that action. So implementation details to bad actors. A real example of that is that sort of it's known that smallpox genome is available online, so it's conceivably that a country could fund a program for that to make something from that. Not completely impossible that this has already happened, even. Although there's some interesting stuff I'll get into later where sort of when it was published, people actually couldn't do such good de novo gene synthesis. So there's some awkward stuff around you have to model forward. And then there's implementation details to careless actors. And sort of there's a low-key example of this in that sort of a biohacker, one biohacker injected himself with something to try to enhance muscle growth. My guess would be that it was probably, getting rid of myostatin? It's there's some protein that sort of removes muscle, and he was probably trying to silence that, but I can't swear on that. That's just the way I can think of that people have tried to do this. And some more brash people ended up injecting themselves with an untested herpes treatment, which did not work. But yeah, some people assume that because CRISPR eventually has the potential to do like some extremely cool things, that it's trivial to implement, and this is just not true. And it's got actually a very high error rate in genome. So if anyone's actually managed to achieve the level of competence where they can actually get it into probably the nucleus, but not quite enough competence to realize that will probably just result in it making a bunch of random cuts, which could result in cancer. There's like a bad realm of semi-competence there that is potentially rather dangerous, and while currently sort of this group of people is leaning probably towards the somewhat too incompetent to implement this particular thing, smarter people I think have actually implemented some very weird stuff. Like one person, I think, injected their eyes with something that let them see, have more or less biological night vision. It was really bizarre. But he actually respected the fact that he had substantial risk if he actually looked at sunlight. So it didn't end horribly for him. But there's a valley where people have enough competence to be able to semi-implement something, and that's not good. So some complications. What if your current information isn't hazardous in the current environment, but future tech will make it dangerous? So yeah, I think I went over this earlier, but the smallpox genome, when it was published, we didn't really have all of this new tech we have that makes it so easy to print de novo genomes, and that changed. And if we wanted to be actually judicious about risk, we have to think ahead of time of in what direction things are going to change and whether the thing will become hazardous in the next 10, 20, even 30 years, which is a heck of a lot to ask of people because it's not necessarily trivial. But it ends up being a kind of key part of what ends up being really risky or not. And then there's also where information one's inferential step out is hazardous. It could theoretically be more inferential steps, but like one is easier to explain and presumably higher probability. So like you might have a case where your information itself is not hazardous, but like it could be reused in a hazardous way that someone will probably think of. So toy example was like if you sort of show a vulnerable step that a bioterrorist could like release at, there's some chance, or yeah, I don't know if this is the best toy example. I'm just kind of ignore it right now. So a real example would be things like the de novo synthesis of horsepox. The instructions for that could probably just be transferred over for smallpox. I maybe shouldn't be talking this much about smallpox exclusively, but that's the examples I had. So risks of inadequate information sharing. So there's also some risks associated with not sharing things. And it might also be a good time for me to note that there's also degrees of sharing. Like if you, I think explicitly in one of the biological risks of information hazard for biological risks papers that, darn it, I'm forgetting the group. One of the EA groups came out with. Thank you. Yeah, FHI. They explicitly mentioned that you can probably sort of skew who will end up reading or being able to read your papers by just like deliberately using scientific jargon that scientists will just be able to easily decode, and random people probably will not. But there's a certain degree of sort of forgivable obfuscation that you could do, or publishing in academic journals and making sure you're not the first article on the cover. That there's ways or just generally that there's some ways to try to skew the transmission of your information towards only the experts who will probably have the most substantial probability of being able to mitigate the risk, rather than while trying to minimize its transmission among people who might want to implement the risk. And that all seems sensible. So there's also a matter of like what audience you get it to, and there's ways you can influence that. But one risk is that information could have helped advise countermeasures, and not having that transmitted is itself kind of a hazard. So as an example was sort of some of the information about the bird flu, which eventually like Americans sort of decided they wanted to actually transmit. But early on, sort of people banned the publication of the methods, and I think that was helpful for some vaccine, potentially. There's siloing information, which leaves individual workers blind to an overall goal. This one I think I didn't have any concrete examples of, but it occurred to me when I thought about sort of there's already some degree of a market for just sort of send away lab work. If that ends up getting big and cheap enough, there's a possibility that someone can end up assembling something dangerous without necessarily realizing they were doing it, because they don't know what the other parts of the system that they're going to hand off to are doing. So that seems so not having good enough information transmission to piece that together seems potentially dangerous. Yeah.
I guess I could offer an example that's part of that. Like if you have somebody ordering different pieces of genes from different companies, and they don't talk to each other, and the whole thing together is
Mhm. Yep. Yeah, that seems true.
a less hypothetical, though not biological example. The Chernobyl accident was caused by a shift change happening that wasn't supposed to happen in the middle of the test. So the people that were coming in didn't know everything that was supposed to be going on. So the people that had left, there had been some sort of unexpected delay, and they decided to push forward with it anyway. And no one person had the information to know that what they were doing was stupid.
Interesting.
The Soviet government had suppressed information about like certain kinds of reactor safety.
Oh gosh.
So none of the people in the plant did.
Shit. I actually know a case very similar to that, where what is it? One of the plane crashes. I'm forgetting the number, but there was a plane crash that happened where they recently looked in more detail into what had gone wrong, and it sounded like sort of the detection of I think where the nose was pointing or something was off systematically, and there was a automatic thing that the plane did in order to try to where it thought it was in a spin or something, and so it just automatically shifted the nose downward and would just repeatedly do that unless you were actively defying it. And one group of people sort of had run into the group of people before the ones who had the crash had run into this problem and had managed to correctly navigate it, but they didn't pass on that information to the next people on the shift, and the next people on the shift ended up having it go into an involuntary nosedive, and people died. So yeah, it's not an isolated incident, unfortunately. This sounds like it's a whole class of problem.
I also saw the recent CRISPR babies controversy being called up as an example of siloing and some of the dangers of it, because the doctors who were helping with the conception of these babies didn't know that they were modified, and the people working on the IVF CRISPR didn't know that they were going to actually be implanted and lead to a pregnancy. So I think that's another example of insufficient information sharing leading to risks.
In the case of an organization that maliciously ordered different genes that find their pathogenic, companies that don't talk to each other, it seems like even if they do talk to each other, it's really hard to prevent organizations malicious. You don't have to be the same person to make all the different orders.
It's fair. I mean, if the timing is similar, but yeah, a sufficiently intelligent person could still manage to obfuscate things. That unfortunately just seems to be true. Barriers to funding. So another thing that might happen is that if there's a field where people aren't allowed to talk about it, who the hell is going to fund you? I mean, I guess unless you manage to get in with I guess there still are some options sometimes, like Department of Defense and that kind of thing, maybe. But sort of an example outside of biology is just sort of AI safety didn't receive very much funding until after Bostrom's superintelligence, and there were pretty strong positive effects on that, on the funding of it after that. And theoretically, there might be a similar problem for sort of larger scale biological risks, in that if it turns out that it's a thing you can't publish very often, it's hard to convince people that you're accomplishing something that needs to be funded, or even if your stuff is low quality, it's hard for people to know. There's barriers to new talent if your stuff is sort of. So one real example would be that some labs opt out of potentially valuable pathogen research because the regulations have increased the operating cost, and they just don't find that trade-off worth it. And another example is if someone who wanted to get into sort of the EA biorisks thing, the absence of anything like surface level information might manage to deter them from it, or might manage them to convince them to search elsewhere. So if it's hard to get in, you're going to get fewer people, and you might manage to accidentally miss some of the high quality ones because they have other options. And the other risk is that dangerous work is not stopped. And a real life almost example was from the Silmar talk we did months and months ago, that there was a grad student who mentioned to some other grad student, like before the Asilomar conference, there was a grad student who mentioned to other grad students that her lab might decide to use a virus to put bacterial DNA into mammalian cells, and they were somewhat horrified. And after a little bit, she realized that, oh shit, nobody really had thought through that this was potentially dangerous. And in the end, her supervisor ended up getting told that he should not put genes into a phage that grows in a bug that grows in your gut, and that SV40 is a small animal tumor virus, and it does turn human cells into cancer-like cells, so maybe this is dangerous. Please don't do this. This sort of thing was also a meaningful contributor to the decision that that they needed to pull together the Asilomar conference and like start self-regulating, because this sort of accident really needs to be avoided. Yeah.
Just to be clear, there's like a typo in the thing that he was told specifically not to.
Berg, yeah, Berg was, or at least told to substantially.
Okay, that's what the negative is. Okay.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, doesn't grow in a bug that grows in your gut. Yeah. And then there's a Streisand effect where bad information suppression results in information dissemination. So, for instance, with the smallpox genome, probably more people know about it because people tried to suppress it. Like that's, and because people wrote about the attempts to suppress it. There might be some point where this usually comes into play when you're already at a fairly late stage, where it's kind of a media level problem or something. And I think sort of publishing it in a very obscure academic journal, sometimes that would work out the way you want it, unless somebody else realizes that it's a problem and then makes a big review or something of it. It seems like a whole a whole bag of worms that's sort of messy and counterintuitive.